When I was 16, near Gorn Park, my father and I were driving up to our cabin in the middle of winter. I always found the park to be stunning and had spent every summer there, enjoying its beauty. The cabin was by a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. In the summer, the lake area would fill with people, and the town's population would triple. It was a popular vacation spot, with everyone enjoying days on the water and warm nights around campfires with family and friends. I had spent all my summers there growing up, and the memories still make me smile. Sunshine, laughter, and the sound of boats on the lake. But winter was a different story. Most people who didn't live there year-round would head back to the city, leaving the area mostly deserted. The cottages were closed up for the season, and only a few people would visit every now and then. During the winter, the lake would fall quiet, and the town would be populated by just the locals. The pine trees, covered in snow, made the forest feel calm and still. Our cabin was on a dead-end road with about 20 other cottages, ours being roughly in the middle. The cottages were spread out, so we couldn't see our neighbors through the trees. My dad needed to go up to the cabin to do some painting that my mom had been asking him to get done. This was in late February during a long weekend, so I went along to keep him company and spend some time together. The drive from home was about 5 hours, but because of heavy snow, it took us closer to 8 hours. It got dark early, and by the time we were driving through the park, it was around midnight. The silence was eerie, with nothing but the car's headlights breaking the pitch-black night. After finally getting through the park, we were about 30 minutes from the cabin. The snow had stopped, and we were both eager to get there. As we turned onto the familiar road, I heard my dad mutter under his breath. It hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't unusual. It probably wouldn't be cleared until later in the day. As we continued down the road, I noticed fresh tire tracks. The Johnsons must be up for the weekend, my dad said. Then, as we rounded a corner, our headlights hit a white van parked on the side of the road, almost hidden by the snow-covered trees. "What the?" my dad mumbled as we passed the van. I looked back through the rear window and clearly saw two people sitting in the front seats, illuminated by our car's taillights. I told my dad, and he shrugged. "Maybe they're lost." I nodded, but something felt off. It was a dead-end road. Why would anyone stop there? When we pulled into our driveway and started unloading the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept thinking about that van and why it was there, with two people just sitting in the dark. It freaked me out so much that I asked my dad if I could sleep upstairs with him instead of in the downstairs room that my sister and I usually shared. That room had big windows with no blinds, and I was already scared of the dark. It wasn't a big deal when my sister was there, but tonight was different. While my dad got ready for bed, I sat in the living room reading a book. He had turned off all the lights, so I was using a small lamp by the couch to read one last chapter before going to bed. It was so quiet that I could almost hear my own breathing. Suddenly, I had this creepy feeling like I was being watched. The living room had two large windows with no curtains, looking out over the lake. It was completely dark, except for a few faint lights from the cottages across the water. I turned off the lamp and stood up. Now that the cabin was dark, the moonlight reflected off the snow, making the outside look almost bright. As I looked out, movement caught my eye, and my heart sank. I saw two figures near the back porch, barely hidden by the trees. I dropped to the floor and crawled toward my dad's bedroom. He was already asleep. My heart was pounding, and I wasn't sure if the people outside had seen me. I woke my dad, and by the time he got to the window, the figures were gone. Where I had seen them, there were now two sets of footprints in the snow leading from the back porch to the driveway and then down the road. I begged my dad not to go outside. He checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hoping to scare them off. My dad wasn't as scared as I was, but he set the alarm before going back to bed. I lay awake all night, terrified that if I looked out the window, I'd see someone staring back at me. The next morning, my dad went outside and confirmed what I had seen. 2 sets of footprints leading from the road around the back of the cabin and then back to the road. There were tire marks showing that the van had turned around and left. My dad figured they were trying to break in and steal something since it was winter and the area was mostly empty. They must have known we were there, though. Our car was in the driveway, and they would have seen the light I had turned on to read. My dad didn't have any answers, and after debating it, he called the non-emergency line to report it. Apparently, there had been some break-ins recently, and some items were stolen from other cottages that had been shut for the season. Still, I wonder to this day, why would they be interested in breaking into a place that clearly had people inside? This story takes place about 11 years ago. I was a senior in high school at the time, and it remains the most baffling thing I've ever experienced. It's important to mention that it happened in mid-December. I live in North Dakota, and winters here get brutally cold at night. If you get stuck outside, the freezing temperatures could be deadly. The snow also makes everything eerily quiet, so you can hear the slightest sounds both inside and outside the house. One night, my best friend and I were hanging out in my family's walkout basement, just trying to pass the time playing video games. We were the only ones home. My mom had gone straight from work to meet some coworkers at a bar for drinks, so we figured we could sneak into the family's wine stash and have a bit of fun. As we were opening our first bottle, I suddenly heard the door leading to the garage swing open and then slam shut. I immediately panicked, thinking, "Oh no," and started looking for a place to hide the bottle. My friend asked, "I thought you said your mom was going to be out all night?" I replied, "She was." Then I heard a few heavy footsteps and my mom's voice calling out, "Is anyone home?" I shouted back, "Yeah, we're just hanging out in the basement, Mom." I heard a few more footsteps coming from the garage towards the stairs, and then she called out again, "Hey, can you come help me with something? I need you up here." While scrambling to hide the wine bottle, I replied, "Yeah, just give me a minute, Mom." After about 20 seconds of silence, she yelled again, but this time with a tone that was more serious and sounded slightly off. "Is anyone down there with you?" This was the first thing that made me feel uneasy. My family didn't care if I had friends over, and we always had an open house for guests. But it wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it. The voice sounded like hers, but there was something missing, something I couldn't quite identify. Feeling weirded out, I replied, "It's just Colton." After I said that, I finally found a good spot to stash the wine bottle and started heading up the stairs. As I climbed, I felt an overwhelming sense of silence and this strange electric feeling like something was very wrong. When I reached the top, I looked towards the garage door and then over to the kitchen next to it. Everything was pitch black, no lights on, no moonlight streaming through the windows. I walked into the kitchen, calling out, "Mom, where are you?" But there was no response, just silence and darkness. That uneasy electric feeling grew stronger, like needles prickling my skin, and my adrenaline kicked in. I had to get out of there. My mom wasn't home. I rushed back downstairs, grabbing my coat as I went. "What's going on?" Colton asked. I replied quickly, "My mom's not home," as I frantically searched for my truck keys. "What do you mean? You were just talking to her," Colton said, completely confused. "There's no one here, man. We need to go now." I took a few steps towards the back door, which opened into the yard, but then I noticed my dog trembling on the couch and my cat growling behind it. Couldn't leave them. I knew something was off. Colton, still bewildered, asked, "Are we leaving?" I replied, "No, I can't leave them alone. Something's wrong. I'm gonna call my mom." I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. She answered right away. "Hey, sweetie, what's going on?" I asked, "Mom, were you just home? I heard you calling for me, but when I went upstairs, you weren't there." I hoped she was playing some kind of prank. "No, I'm just leaving the bar now. I wasn't feeling well. Are you okay?" "What do you mean you heard me?" she asked, sounding concerned. I told her the whole story, and she rushed home. Colton and I stayed downstairs with the pets, but before she arrived, we could hear something moving upstairs, not walking, but like a pressure in the air, something heavy moving from room to room. The best word to describe it was hungry. When my mom finally got home, whatever it was left as suddenly as it came. It felt like a predator that had just flown away. To this day, we've never figured out what happened, and this is just one of many strange experiences I've had. This one stands out because I had a witness. Sadly, my mom has since passed away and I've moved to Arizona, but whenever I go back to North Dakota and see Colton, he still gets creeped out by what happened that night. I may never know exactly what it was, but I know that whatever it was, it mimicked my mom's voice and it felt evil and hungry. Once during my time at university, I misplaced the key to my car and didn't have a spare. It was midwinter, and I had no choice but to walk to a dealership about 6 or 7 miles from my apartment to get a replacement. Looking back, this seems like such a strange and desperate choice to make. I think I used the winter as an excuse not to ask anyone for a ride, but honestly, it was the best reason to avoid asking. Walking in the snow is a hassle, but I was young, and 7 miles didn't seem that far at the time. Let me tell you, I was completely wrong. This turned out to be one of the most tiring things I've ever done. The first mile took my breath away, but after that, every step felt like it took a lot more effort. I wasn't exactly full of energy to begin with, given the stress of losing my car key, so I was already starting out at a disadvantage. Another mistake I made was not realizing I would have to walk another 7 miles back home. I really had not planned this out at all. I made it to the dealership fine by early afternoon, but it took much longer than I expected to get the replacement key. The quote I received over the phone was much shorter than what they told me while I waited. An hour turned into 2, and then I heard nothing. By the time the sun went down, snow began to fall, and finally, someone came out with an envelope bearing my name. 2 keys were inside, and I just had to navigate the snowy roads in the dark to get back. I pulled my thin hoodie tight against the wind and snow, but it was no use. The gusts cut right through it, and my face was completely frozen within 10 minutes. My phone showed the temperature dropping from 19 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, factoring in the wind chill which had made my scarf stiff. I tucked it inside my jacket to warm it and cover my face, but it didn't help much. I could feel my lips starting to blister from the cold. To make things worse, I had forgotten my inhaler. It was in my school bag. I had to be cautious about how I breathed all the way back, as my breathing was the only thing I could control. I ended up slowing down my pace to accommodate my lungs, and moving more slowly in the freezing temperatures felt like a death sentence for someone like me. I began to hear this odd little clicking noise and realized that the condensation from my breath had frozen on my eyelashes. The wind caused them to clink together every time I blinked. At first, I laughed, but after hearing it repeatedly, I started to panic. Would my eyelashes break off before I got home? Would the frost turn to liquid in my eyes and freeze them too? I kept getting colder and had to exert more effort just to keep moving. Eventually, the inevitable asthma attack hit me about 3 blocks from my apartment. It started as a burning sensation, and soon my lungs felt empty and shriveled, as if someone had hit me in the back with a sledgehammer, knocking the wind out of me. Now I was trying to recover through a straw, and it was a terrifying feeling. I couldn't afford to fall deeper into this attack. Somehow, I managed to stagger the rest of the way. I lost track of whether my feet were moving or not. Sometimes it felt like I was standing still, but when I looked down, I was actually moving. It was a strange kind of hallucination. When I finally arrived home, I knew all I had to do was get to my inhaler, which I knew exactly where to find. I climbed the stairs, opened the door, and collapsed on the couch where I left my bag. My numb fingers fumbled to get it out, but I only managed one of the 2 puffs I needed before the oxygen deprivation caused me to pass out. I had never blacked out before, and the involuntary nature of the experience was unsettling. My roommates thought I was just napping and covered me with a blanket, still in my boots. I regained consciousness feeling weak and wheezing. As I became aware of what had happened, I quietly broke down into tears. I could feel the chill deep within my body and was afraid to take off my boots to see how my feet looked. That 1 puff had been enough to partially open my airway. I used my inhaler again, and although I probably should have gone to the hospital, I just layered up, made a cup of mint tea, and went to bed. My body seemed fine aside from the utterly exhausted muscles in my legs and a throbbing headache, but not enough to motivate me to leave the house again. Then I remembered the keys in the envelope, the whole point of my mission, my trek through the winter landscape. I rushed back to my coat, opened it up, and checked the inside pocket. There they were, safe and sound. Everything was right in my winter wonderland. My roommates were astonished when I told them what had happened the next day. They genuinely thought I had just been deeply asleep. I was incredibly lucky to have made it back safely, so I decided that next time, I'd just ask for a ride. I didn't live there, but I spent a couple of months helping my grandfather close down his second farm. He was selling off the land and buildings to focus full-time on his larger farm up in Vermont. Knowing I needed work, they called me, and I drove up from Philadelphia in my beat-up Ford Focus. The job itself wasn't tough, just repetitive. Mostly, it involved moving animals and their feed, loading trailer after trailer of chickens, pigs, cows, and even a few horses. It had been a while since I worked with livestock, and I was happy to be back at it. There's something fulfilling about working with animals. They each have their own quirks and personalities, and they never talk back. By the end of the day, knowing they're all taken care of feels rewarding. Fast forward about a month, and we had moved most of the animals when a massive blizzard hit. But this wasn't just any storm. The farm was nestled at the base of a gentle slope, and in heavy snow areas, this type of terrain can be a nightmare. The snow would slide down the hill in sheets until it couldn't slide anymore, piling up. In some spots, the drifts were as high as 20 feet. To give you an idea, the snow was as tall as 2 of the outbuildings and much taller than any of the stables or coops. We had barrels burning wood and tires every few feet to keep a path clear between the house and barn. These fires were essential because if snow put them out, we couldn't relight them easily, and the barrels had to be replaced. Rolling around an 800-degree steel barrel wasn't fun. The wind was the strongest I'd ever seen, and the family said they hadn't experienced anything like it in over 50 years. If you opened a door leading outside, you had to push with both arms, and you had to shield your eyes because the wind could freeze the moisture in your eyes faster than you could blink. That happened to all of us, and the pain was unimaginable. My uncle and I took turns refilling a gas can to keep the generators running, which was the only thing keeping us alive. The wood stoves and burning barrels were helpful, but the electricity was critical. It felt like we were living in a different century, working in shifts to keep everything going and wondering when it would end. Then, in the middle of the storm, my uncle slipped and broke his leg. He was out there by himself when it happened, and I didn't think to check on him until he hadn't come back with the gas. I bundled up and fought through the wind and cold until I reached the barn, slamming the door behind me. There he was, lying on the frozen ground. He told me he had yelled for a while but knew no one could hear him over the wind, so he just waited. I helped him up with a makeshift walking stick and got him back inside. Luckily, my aunt, who was helping with the move, happened to be a doctor. She set his leg and splinted it as best she could. This development meant that most of the work now fell on me. I started hauling wood and restocking the house, carrying armfuls back and forth until I could barely move. The ice had started to freeze on my face, and I had to thaw by the fire before heading back out again. But we needed more than wood, we needed fuel. I made several trips and gathered 6 gallons of gas before my fingers and toes started to feel like they were on the verge of frostbite. I wasn't about to lose any limbs for the small amount of money they were paying me. Then my grandfather asked for one last favor, a final check of the barn to make sure everything was secure. Since I was still bundled up, I agreed. As I headed back into the storm, the snow was piling up again, and the drifts were towering over the property like massive white giants. I reached the barn, and everything seemed in order. Fuel lines closed, lights off, nothing out of place. But something strange caught my attention. Silence. After 2 days of non-stop howling wind, I suddenly couldn't hear anything. Yet I could still see the wind blowing outside. I thought maybe something was wrong with me, like a symptom of hypothermia or something worse. I feared my senses were starting to fail, maybe one at a time. Then I noticed the barn walls. They seemed to be twisting, like they were starting to bend. I stood there, staring in disbelief, thinking I was hallucinating. But then I heard a loud pop, like a crack or a snap. I looked up, and the walls were rippling. A window shattered above me, and that's when it hit me. The reason I couldn't hear the wind was because the snow had completely covered the barn. The drifts were so high and dense that they insulated the building, muffling the wind. But all that weight was starting to shift, and the barn was seconds away from collapsing. I left everything as it was and ran for the door, diving out onto the ice and sliding on my chest towards one of the burning barrels. I turned around just in time to see a 40-foot snow drift swallow the barn hole. For some reason, I had expected a loud crash, but the snow kept it eerily quiet. When I got back inside and told Grandpa what had happened, he was in shock, as was the rest of the family when the clouds cleared and the sun came out half an hour later. That was the last winter job I ever took. When I was 14, I had a paper route. It was one of those old school jobs where I'd be out early, around 6 a.m., carrying a bag and dropping off newspapers at houses. It was a decent gig, just what you'd imagine. The only downside was having to work no matter the weather. Rain, snow, whatever. Even in total darkness during a storm, the papers still had to be delivered. That's probably why they hired kids back then. They could push them to go, and we had to walk the route no matter what. One winter morning, I was out on my usual route, and it was still dark. I liked these shifts because it felt like the world hadn't fully woken up yet. It was kind of comforting seeing all the houses still warm inside, maybe with a little smoke coming from the chimneys. There was something peaceful about it, perhaps because it was around the holiday season. I kept moving along in the cold, with the dim glow from the streetlights casting weak yellow beams on the snow below. Everything felt especially still and almost eerie. I paused between houses now and then to catch my breath, but really, it was to take in my surroundings. I couldn't shake this strange feeling that morning, like something was off, but I couldn't figure out what. As I passed by a house at the end of a quiet street, I suddenly heard 2 loud bangs, followed by a third one a minute later. I grew up around people who hunted, so I recognized the sound right away, but I kept going with my deliveries. I just assumed it was a car backfiring or something. I'd seen that happen to my dad's truck and other cars in town, so it seemed like the most logical explanation to my 14-year-old mind, more so than the idea of gunshots. I didn't say anything to anyone at first, not wanting to make a big deal out of something that might not have been serious. When I finally told my parents what I heard, they brushed it off, saying it was likely just a car backfiring. That explanation comforted me, and I went on with my day, believing them because it was easier than considering the alternative. But later that morning, our street was flooded with police and news crews, all focused on that same house. They were talking to neighbors, asking if anyone had been around the area at the time. My parents told me to stay inside, but I wasn't planning to go out there anyway. I hesitated to tell anyone what I'd heard because it felt strange, like I'd be doing something wrong. Even talking to my parents about it had felt wrong. It left a deep, unsettling feeling. I didn't know all of our neighbors at the time, but if any of them had died, I didn't want to know. That realization hit me hard, that I might have been the first to know something terrible had happened. Maybe that's why I didn't speak up right away. It felt sad, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't my place to talk about it. This experience left me with a quiet but lasting sense of dread that stuck with me for years. Over the following days, we learned what had happened. The man living in that house was older, at least older than my dad, and had been part of the neighborhood for a long time. His son had recently returned from the military after a deployment. He brought someone with him, a guy who turned out to be his boyfriend. When the son came out to his father that morning, things went horribly wrong. The father shot both his son and his son's boyfriend, and then he took his own life. No one really knew the details of what led up to it, but the whole community was shaken. It was likely that the son and his boyfriend had been planning to leave that morning, but the father just couldn't handle the situation. The event affected everyone, but for me, it hit especially hard. I didn't deliver papers for a while after that, and everyone understood why, even the editor of the paper. But for me, it wasn't just a local tragedy. It felt like I was somehow connected to it, like I was there in some way, hearing those shots. Be kind to yourselves and others. You never know what someone's carrying with them. I was driving home with my family after visiting my sister, who lives in a nearby town. I was still learning to drive and had gotten fairly good at it. My stepdad let me drive on the way there to get some practice with winter highway driving, so naturally, I was behind the wheel for the return trip too. The storm wasn't supposed to hit until later in the evening, so we thought we'd be fine. Looking back, I don't know what anyone was thinking letting me drive in those conditions. I had barely any experience on the road, yet here we were, speeding down the highway with a snowstorm on the way. We even joked about how this might be the last road trip we'd ever take. It started snowing right as we left, which didn't seem too bad at first. I knew how to handle driving in the snow, but the weather quickly got worse. About 10 minutes into the drive, it turned into a complete whiteout. I was in the left lane, it was 8 p.m., and it was the middle of January, peak winter where we lived. The snow was coming down so fast that it was like watching light speed in a sci-fi movie, with snowflakes zooming past the windshield. But the snow was so thick that it quickly covered the glass, and the headlights bouncing off the flakes made it impossible to see. The snow was piling up on the edges of the windshield by the inch. On top of that, we were on a Canadian highway, so the only light came from the car's headlights. I was somehow able to stay calm despite the situation, and my stepdad was trying to help guide me to find a safe spot to pull over. But the wind was blowing snow everywhere, and we couldn't see the ditches or even the lines on the road. I had two major worries. First, I was in the left lane, so if I pulled over, I might misjudge the distance and end up in a snow-filled ditch. Second, I couldn't see the lane markers, so there was a good chance I'd drift out of my lane if I kept driving. The only thing I could do was keep going until I knew it was safe to stop. I used the rumble strips as my guide, feeling the slight vibrations as the tires hit them. I was driving about 45 in a 75 zone, and my stepdad was directing me toward a road where his parents lived, thinking it would be a safer place to stop. We passed at least 8 cars stuck in ditches between my sister's town and my grandparents' road. My speed kept dropping as the storm worsened. The sky got darker, and the snow began freezing on the highway. The tires started slipping, and the faster I went, the less control I had. At one point, the road was completely covered in snow, and I couldn't even feel the rumble strips anymore. I was driving purely on instinct. Suddenly, I hit a patch of ice at a strange angle and spun into the oncoming lane. Somehow, I managed to regain control of the car, saw faint headlights approaching, and realized we were in the wrong lane. I quickly steered us back to the correct side of the road. My mom, sitting in the back seat, was panicking after we spun out, and I was the one making decisions behind the wheel. There was no way she could just jump up front and take over. My stepdad, though less calm than I was, tried his best to stay composed, resisting the urge to grab the wheel out of fear. I could barely see an inch beyond the front of the car, but finally we reached his parents' road and pulled over. We switched seats, and when I got out, the snow was up to my shins. We ended up staying the night at my grandparents' place because there was no way we were getting home safely in that storm. About 15 minutes after we arrived, the highway was closed due to the dangerous conditions. The next morning, we had to dig our way out of the house just to leave. I got to skip school that day, stuck out of town, while everyone else had to go. That was my first winter driving with a learner's permit, and it happened during a blizzard. If we had a smaller car, we might not have made it to my grandparents' house at all. I was terrified, but I didn't want to show it, especially with my mom in the back seat freaking out. I never should have been driving that night, but the experience helped me learn how to handle difficult drives, and it made me a better driver in the long run. It was a wild trip, one I'll never forget. I was pretty new to driving, and one night, after finishing a late shift at work, I decided it was the perfect time for my first drive across a frozen lake. I live in Wisconsin, and this is a big rite of passage here. It's exactly what it sounds like. People driving their cars across the frozen surface of large lakes. It's actually less dangerous than it seems because the ice can be 4 to 5 feet thick, basically like driving on solid ground. Sometimes you'll see several trucks parked close together on the ice, thousands of pounds resting on top of it without any issues. Fishermen often drill holes into the ice to fish, and even with those holes and extra weight, the ice still holds strong. I kept all this in mind as I left the shore and rolled out onto the frozen water. It's a strange, unsettling feeling at first. Driving on ice is no different than driving on land in terms of control, but in the back of your mind, you know that just a few feet beneath you is hundreds of feet of water. Things started off fine, but as I got closer to the middle of the lake, I began to feel nervous. It was hard to see anything except the plowed path ahead, and I realized I didn't know where I was supposed to exit the lake, or if the path even crossed all the way. That's when things could go wrong. People sometimes got lost when trying to cross these lakes, especially if they strayed off the path and ended up in the wilderness. Some would drive into tracks that suddenly ended, facing a massive snow wall with no room to turn around. The only option in those cases was to reverse all the way back to shore. Not wanting to risk that, I decided to turn around and head home. I came across a small clearing that looked like a good spot to turn around. It wasn't big, but there wasn't any snow piled up either. I stopped the car, which made me even more nervous, like the weight of the car was suddenly heavier when it wasn't moving. Logically, I knew it didn't matter if the car was moving or not. Either the ice would hold or it wouldn't. But as soon as I backed off the plowed path, I got stuck in over a foot of snow. I tried everything. Putting my floor mat under the tire for traction, which ended up shooting the mat 20 feet behind me, and digging the snow out with my ice scraper. All I managed to do was break a fingernail and start bleeding. This was long before cell phones, so I eventually accepted that I had to walk home. I was at least 3 miles from shore, and realizing how far out I was on the lake was a little frightening. The walk back to shore alone was nearly a mile. I gathered up what supplies I had, mostly jackets and other things to keep warm, and set out with a small, dim red flashlight. It was about -15 degrees outside, and I don't know if you've ever tried walking across a frozen lake in the wind, but there's nothing to block it. By the time I reached shore, I was genuinely afraid I might freeze to death. Eventually, I came upon some houses, and even though I'm pretty shy and introverted, I forced myself to knock on a door to ask for help. Someone answered, and I explained my situation, asking to use their phone. I called home, relieved to be inside and out of the cold. My younger brother answered the phone, and I told him to get Dad. His response? Nope. I told him to stop joking and that I needed help, but he hung up on me. I tried calling again, but he must have taken the phone off the hook because all I got was a busy signal. After a few more tries and feeling increasingly awkward about staying in a stranger's house, I decided to walk the rest of the way home. The thought of how angry I was at my brother kept me going, and I eventually made it home with only a small spot of frostbite on my finger from a hole in my glove. When I got home, my dad gave my brother an earful for not helping me, and I got a lecture about driving onto the lake. The next day, Dad took me back to get my car, which luckily hadn't been towed. I haven't felt the urge to drive on a frozen lake again. I was heading up to a ski resort after a snowstorm. Since I didn't have much money at the time, I hadn't gotten winter tires. Anyone who lives in snowy areas knows how important they are. They won't get you out of every tough spot, but they'll help keep you out of ditches if you drive carefully. There was a big truck in front of me, a car to my left, and another vehicle behind me. This was almost the worst position to be in while driving on snow. My car was in the middle of any potential chaos, so I tried to stay sharp and focused. But after about 20 minutes of uneventful driving, I started to relax and zone out, as anyone would when things seem calm. Something shifted in the passenger seat, so I glanced over for just a split second. I didn't have to adjust anything, but even that brief moment of distraction was enough to set things in motion. Snow is unforgiving, and without winter tires, my worn-out city tires lost control instantly. I had only managed to stay on track by following the tire marks left by the truck ahead of me, but just a small patch of slush sent me sliding. The right wheels of my car slipped onto the shoulder, and I immediately lost traction. The car drifted further right onto the shoulder. I thought I might just crash into the guardrail, cause some damage to the car, and then get back on the road. It wasn't an ideal outcome, but it seemed better than spinning out completely. I took my foot off the gas, trying to coast, no brakes, just light steering. I knew using the pedals would only make things worse and could send me spinning faster. I was ready for a bump into the guardrail, but the snow had built up against it, creating a natural barrier that bounced my car back onto the road. I stared in disbelief and fear as my car began to slide in the other direction. I passed over the tracks I had been following, but I didn't have enough time to react and pull out of the skid. Between my slow reaction and the impact of the snowbank, my car, still without proper traction, drifted to the left. The truck ahead of me started to slow down, but I didn't dare brake, fearing I'd lose the little control I had left. I didn't want to crash into the back of the truck, which could have sent me through the windshield or worse. My car slid sideways across the lane, and I braced for what was coming, possibly sideswiping the car in the next lane. We didn't touch, but I veered sharply into their lane before sliding back into mine. We came within inches of hitting, but the other driver, in a better equipped car, was able to steer away from me. The embarrassment of nearly causing a serious accident jolted me back into full awareness. Just as I reached the center of the lane, my tires finally found some grip on the road again. I tapped the brakes carefully to avoid crashing into the truck that was now right in front of me. My car started moving forward properly again, even speeding up slightly through the snow. Looking back, it feels like all of this took ages, but the entire event probably happened in just a few seconds. Car accidents have a strange way of making time feel like it's stretching out, as you watch things either get better or worse very quickly. In the end, the only thing my car hit was the snowbank, and it didn't even leave a mark. I got incredibly lucky and was beyond grateful. Could have gone so much worse, not just for me, but for the other drivers too. If I had hurt someone else, it would have haunted me forever. And yes, when I got back from the ski resort, I immediately bought snow tires and haven't driven in the winter without them since. I was driving to my job during the end of a huge snowstorm. I work in food service for a college, and many students living on campus don't have kitchens in their dorms or don't even drive, so a lot of them wouldn't eat if we didn't open. This meant we had to travel through some pretty wild conditions, but those students relied on us. Even the nearby restaurants shut down during a level 3 snow emergency in the city. The unspoken rule at work for these situations is to try your best to get there, but don't put yourself in danger. I'm one of the few people there with a 4-wheel drive vehicle, and I drive a big crew cab truck. I usually head to campus and pick up coworkers who live close by and want to come in. I was cruising down the highway at a good speed, with only one lane cleared. I moved to the far left and switched to 4-wheel drive. There weren't many cars out since it was still snowing, and everything felt smooth. I was feeling confident, but I knew that overconfidence can lead to trouble. When you get too relaxed, you stop making smart choices and start just reacting. That's when you lose control. I was going about 40 miles per hour when I noticed headlights approaching me faster than they should be. It had to be an emergency vehicle, right? I wasn't sure, so I signaled to move to the middle lane just in case. The headlights kept coming closer way too quickly for my comfort. Now I could see it was a large, lifted SUV. My truck is pretty big, but I really didn't want to crash, especially in this weather. I figured the SUV had 4-wheel drive too, but what a reckless driver. There was no reason to go that fast on ice and snow. I eased off the gas and began to inch over to the far right lane just as he was about to pass me. Just as we were crossing a bridge, something went wrong for that driver. The ice got him and he started fishtailing. I gently tapped the brakes, trying to slow down without losing control myself. I knew for sure that this driver was in big trouble, maybe even a fatal accident. I was trying to keep my distance when he crashed into something, sending snow flying everywhere. I have a bad habit of pulling other vehicles into the chaos too. There were too many variables with the sliding and the embankments. The SUV lost all traction, spun across my lane, and missed me by inches. Our windshields nearly met, and I could see the fear in the driver's eyes before he spun away into the darkness and off the road. He was exactly what I expected. A young guy, either arrogant or clueless about how to drive in snow. Maybe there was an emergency somewhere, but who knows? We had both just crossed the bridge when he flew off the highway, right where the guardrail ended, crashing into some trees. I saw the branches shake and the snow fall with a whoosh, and then there was nothing but the faint glow of his taillights. Now I had to report this reckless driver. I can't tell you how often I see some fool send their vehicle flying off the road, snow or shine, only to disappear without a trace. Reporting it is the right thing to do because the person might be unconscious and unreachable. They could wake up later with no idea where they are, and even if they remember, a crash can throw things around in a car, so their phone might not be where they left it. Either way, that driver not only crashed because he was reckless, but he also almost took me down with him. I noticed a couple of cars behind me slowing down and pulling off, so I called 911 and continued on to work. I was so tense I thought someone would need to use a crowbar to get me off the truck seat. It's not always the ice and snow that cause trouble. It's the idiots on the road who don't know how to drive safely in it. I live on a small island in Maine, about an hour away by ferry from the mainland. The ferry runs 3 times a week, but often gets canceled due to bad weather. It's a pretty uneventful ride, aside from the beautiful views you get from both shores. The whole setup feels like something out of a Stephen King book, an isolated little town surrounded by water. It's charming, but living here can be inconvenient, especially when you need to travel. One winter, my best friend was having his bachelor party, and missing it was not an option. We had plans for some wild fun, the kind you only see in movies. It was January in Maine. Snow piled high and winds howling, but I had no choice. It wasn't my drive I was worried about. It was the boat and the plane I needed to catch. When I checked their status, everything was showing green, running as usual. I packed my bags, navigated the icy roads, and paid for parking. Looking at the huge waves crashing on the shore, I wondered if I had misread the ferry schedule. No way a boat was running in these conditions, I thought. But sure enough, the status was still green online. When I called to confirm, they assured me the ferry was operating. I even saw it coming back from its previous trip, rocking a little on the rough waves but still making it. That helped calm my nerves a bit, even though I'm no sailor. The passengers who got off seemed fine, not showing any signs of a rough trip. No pale faces or panicked looks, so I decided to board as soon as I could. There was no way I was missing this weekend. I was more ready to drown than miss my friend's bachelor party. Honestly, the captain should have canceled that trip. Once we left the dock, things seemed okay at first. There weren't many of us on board. I was playing on my phone while others chatted. Some were heading to the mainland for events like me, others for errands. But soon, the ferry started to tip too much to one side. Everyone got quiet as we felt it, and it tilted back the other way, but it felt off. Out of the windows, we saw huge waves crashing ahead, water splashing over the sides of the boat. There was nothing but white water all around us, with no land in sight. The captain made an announcement over the PA, saying things were rough but assuring us everything was under control. He told us to stay seated, which didn't help anyone's mood. Waves over 6 feet high were slamming into the boat, and I was grateful I wasn't the one in charge. The rocking continued, getting worse each time. At one point, a massive crack appeared in one of the large viewing windows. The crew quickly moved everyone sitting near it to other seats, but they had to time their movements with the swaying of the boat. Some people who panicked and stood up too quickly were thrown to the floor, gasping for air. They waited until the boat tipped the other way to scramble to new seats. The crack grew worse, but the glass held. The crew reassured us it was double-paned, designed to withstand a lot, even low-caliber bullets. I laughed to myself, thinking, who cares if it can stop a bullet? Can it hold back the entire Atlantic? That glass was nothing compared to the ocean's fury. Looking back, maybe the crew was just as scared as the rest of us, trying to keep themselves calm with whatever comforting words they could think of. It didn't end there, though. The captain mentioned we were running a bit behind schedule but making progress. No one responded. We were all too focused on keeping our stomachs in check. At one point, the boat tipped so far to the side that I had to brace myself against the wall to stop from sliding into it. The wall had practically become the floor and vice versa. Thankfully, I had been sitting alone, so no one fell on me. If there had been luggage or carts on board, we would have been crushed by flying debris. Finally, the storm began to calm down. I don't think we could have taken much more. We were dangerously close to being thrown through those windows and into the freezing water. If that had happened, the glass would have shattered us, and the freezing ocean would have sucked us into the icy depths. We would have faced drowning, hypothermia, or getting battered by the waves, none of it good. But thankfully, it didn't come to that. We made it to shore, docked safely, and I even managed to catch my flight on time. That plane ride? Almost as bad, but that's a story for another time. A few years back, around Thanksgiving, there was a heavy snowfall overnight, about a foot. At the time, I was homeless and traveling on my bike, pulling a heavy cart behind me that had a flat tire. As the day ended and the snow began to fall, I was drenched in sweat and worn out because of that flat tire. I decided I needed to check the tire, as dragging it through the slush was becoming impossible. I found an empty parking lot with a tiny overhang just sticking out a foot from the building's walls. It barely covered me, while my bike and cart were still out in the open. I started working on the tire, inspecting the rip in the rubber, but I soon realized I didn't have the materials to fix it. The storm eased up for a bit, the wind died down, and it was already dark. I figured this spot was as good as any to take a quick rest before dragging my bike back to where I usually slept. What was meant to be a short rest turned into 4 hours of me completely passing out in the parking lot. The problem was, it started snowing again shortly after I fell asleep, and when I woke up, I was buried under another 6 inches of snow. The sweat on my skin and the inside of my coat had turned to ice, and I knew I was either hypothermic or close to it. It took me 30 minutes just to dig my way out of the snow, which was heavy, wet, and dense. My muscles were on the verge of giving up, and even after freeing myself, I could barely stand. I used the handlebars of my bike to pull myself upright. The parking lot was empty with no options in sight. There was an office building nearby, but its entrance was completely snowed in. Then I noticed a dumpster. It wasn't one of my proudest moments, but I stumbled over to my bike cart, pulled out my blanket roll, and headed to the big green dumpster. It had a double flip lid, and I tossed my blankets in before climbing inside after them. Thankfully, the dumpster only had a few bags of trash and some loose cardboard. Nothing too gross. Not that I would have cared at that point. It was my only chance to survive. I spent the night in there, rubbing my arms and legs to keep them from going numb. The cardboard helped, too, as I used it to insulate the lid and block out the wind and snow. I figured my bike and gear would be gone by morning, thinking someone would pass by, see it, and take off with it during the storm. But when I opened the dumpster the next morning, I was surprised. The sun was shining, I felt somewhat recovered, and my bike was still exactly where I had left it. That close call was one of the moments that ultimately helped me turn my life around. Sometimes hitting rock bottom is what you need to change your path.